Okay. Good evening, Campfire Jammers. I'm Dustin Cormier, and this video is called Chord Structure: What Makes Up a Chord. Okay. Now, every chord, without exception, is based. The notes that you're seeing that I'm playing in this chord, the individual notes are based on the major scale. Okay. Now the major scale is the do re mi scale, right? Do re mi fa sol la ti do. All right. Now that's our major scale. Okay. The distance, the musical tones between each one of these is always the same in the major scale. Okay. No matter what key you play that major scale in, whatever chord you play that major scale in, the distance is always going to be the same. You can play it in the C major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, or the D major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay, it's the same major scale played on different parts of the guitar. Okay, this one is just higher than the other. Okay, now don't worry, Campfire Jammers. We're only going to be getting into these guitar scales just for a little bit. Because it's a very important lesson for learning the actual guts of the individual notes in a chord and what makes up a chord and why we're playing the chords the way that we do. Okay. Now, like I said, this video is skippable. If you feel like you just want to sing and jam and play some chords, then feel free to just go to the next video. But I still suggest sometime in your musical career that you check out this video because it's got lessons that are just very important for a songwriter or any kind of guitar player in the long run. You know, it's nice to be able to say that you at least know the whole game of the guitar. Instead of just knowing only half of it, you know what I mean? So now that major scale, the do re mi scale, is the basic major scale form, okay? Which never changes, okay? It's like the universal form of a chair, all right? Now, we recognize in a chair that it's got a back, it's got a surface to sit on, and then it's got 4 legs, all right? You can make that chair out of stone, out of plastic, out of wood. You can make it out of whatever material. You'll always recognize it as a chair, okay? And the musical scales are the same way, okay? I can start this scale right down here, the G major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, right? And then I can play that up here in a whole different chord in the C major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, okay? Now they're the same chair made up of different notes, okay? It's the same major scale played with a different notes or a different material, per se. You know what I mean? Now, each chord is taking, when you see a chord, those individual notes are made up of 3 different notes in that major scale, okay? Now you'll notice in the major scale that there's only 8 notes, okay? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, this is the C major scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Alright? Now, we could keep this going, by the way. We can keep this scale going all the way. We can keep it going forever. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, re. You know what I mean, okay? So that is the fact of the major scales, is that because the notes are always repeating themselves, you can go all the way up to the dog whistle if you wanted, okay? Up so high where the notes are so high that we can barely hear them, right? But the scales are always going to be there. That major scale form constantly is just constantly going on forever, all right? Now, I said that there are 8 notes in the major scale. What that means is that this major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, can also be started here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, do, do, do. Oh, there we go. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. It's really high, but the fact is that this note is the first note of the scale. Just like this is the first note of the scale. Now this is the important thing I'm trying to tell you, is that the first note and the 8th note of the scale, because there's only 8 notes in the scale, okay? The first note and the 8th note are the same note, okay? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. do, 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 do. They're the same note, okay? Just like you can play a C major chord down here, C, or you can play it down here, C. You notice how they have the same tone, the same sound, right? Okay, they're just, except that this chord is played slightly higher up, but it's still a C chord. They're still made of the same notes, okay? It's the same thing as down here. We start on this do, do, and then we go up to the next do. That's still the C note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Okay? And that's what these scales are constantly doing. It's the same 8 notes, that same universal form of a chair going through the same chord, alright? And so that's what we're trying to learn right now, is that this lower note is the same thing as this higher note. Now what you're hearing whenever you play any basic chord is you're hearing what's called the chord triad, okay? So the triad is always the same notes. It's the first degree of the scale, the first number of the scale, the do, right? The third degree of the scale, and the fifth degree of the scale. The first degree, the third, and the fifth, okay? So what this means is if we're looking at our C chord, for example, this note right here is our first note in the chord, the do, right? The next one is this note right here, the second fret of the D string is an E note, okay? That's the third of C. If we're going to go up in our do, re, mi scale, we go do, re, mi. That's the third, okay? 1, 2, 3, right? And then we also want the fifth. Remember, it's the first, the third, and the fifth that makes up the chord triad, which makes up all the chords, okay? So we've got the first C, we've got the third E, and then we've got the fifth G. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, G, 1, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, G, okay? So that means that G is the fifth of C, the fifth degree in the C scale, okay? And when we play, now all those notes are separate notes, but when we play those notes together, we get the C chord, okay? You can see that is all those notes being played together. A chord is basically taking these 3 notes and playing them together so it's like one fat, loud, wide chord, alright? We can translate, see, this is the barbershop quartet harmony, you know? Do it, do it, do it, she'll never know, okay? What those guys are doing when they're playing, each playing a different note, is they're basically making a guitar chord, but with their voices instead. They're going first, do it, third, do it, and then fifth, do it, do, mi, so, right? And they're playing them all together to make a vocal chord, but this is playing all those notes to make a guitar chord, okay? So now you got a sense for what a chord really is, right? Now let's translate this into theory. We can see here that C is our first note, do, E is our third, mi, and then G is our fifth, so, do, mi, so, do it, do it, do it, she'll never know, right? And so you guys can see that. This is an important diagram for us to see, okay? Now, the next thing I want to explain is that this being the first, is C being the first, E being the third, G being the fifth, okay? The distance in any chord between the first, the third, and the fifth, or the distance between any notes in a chord, is always going to be the same amount of distance between them, okay? And I'll try to explain this to you this way, okay? So we have here a funky little diagram. This is supposed to be a centimeter ruler, okay? So for example's sake, we're going to put the first on the 1 centimeter, okay? So let's call this C, all right? Just like C down here is the first of our C major scale, right? This is the major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. All right, that's what this diagram represents, okay? And so C is the first, and that's what we're trying to set up right here, okay? So C is our first note. Now, our third note is going to, remember, this ruler is entirely arbitrary. This does not really have anything to do with music. I'm just trying to explain a metaphor in an interesting way, okay? So, this is our first, the C, and then the E is going to be 2 centimeters away. That's the musical distance, okay? Because remember, and you're going to hear me say this a lot, the distance between the notes in a chord never changes, okay? The first, the third, and the fifth is a sublime thing that's the same distance for every chord, all right? And you'll know what I mean in a moment. Now, we've got our first, our third, the C and the E, and now our fifth is going to be the G, okay? As we can see down here, C is the first, E is the third, and then G is the fifth, okay? We've got our first, our third, and our fifth of our scale, all right? So now G, being the fifth, is going to go on the 5 centimeter mark. Now, these are the same distances, 2 centimeters, 2 centimeters, okay? The point is that 2 centimeters, the distance between the first scale degree and the third scale degree, the distance between, for example, the C in the C major scale and the E in the E major scale, the first and the third, is the same distance in a C chord as it is in any other chord, okay? Now we're going to see this right now. Remember, that was 2 centimeters between the first and the third, and then 2 centimeters between the third and the fifth, okay? Now, let's translate this into a whole new chord. All right, now what we're going to do in this diagram is we're going to, now this is our major scale, okay? We're going to change our major scale so that it starts on the F instead, okay? Now, if you'll just give me one moment, you can see here that F is now our first, F is the first, A is now our third, and C is now our fifth, okay? And the distances between the first and the third on the F and the A are the same thing as the distance between the C and the E, okay? C, D, E, F, G, A, right? Now that distance is going to be the same, okay? And we're going to translate that onto our nifty little ruler, okay? So, for the sake of this example, we're going to, we're going to put our number 1 on the 4 centimeter mark, okay? We can see that. So that is the first scale degree, all right? Now, like I said, and I'll say it again, the distance between, the musical distance between any note in a chord is always going to be the same, okay? Now, we know the distance between the first note, the C, and the third note of the C chord, which is the E, that was 2 centimeters, okay? Now, what is the distance between the first and the third for our F chord? Well, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to translate into 2 centimeters, so we can see that our first note being on the 4 centimeter mark, our third note of our scale degree is going to be on the 6 centimeter mark. It's going to be 2 centimeters away, okay? Because the distance between an F and an A is the same thing as the distance between a C and an E, all right? Now, you guys should know where I'm going with this. If we're going to translate that into the fifth, we've got our first and our third, so where's our fifth going to go? Well, if we remember our old chord, the C chord, we went from the first to the third, and that was 2 centimeters. Now we're going to go from the E to the G, which is another 2 centimeters, okay? So now you can see where I'm going with this. We've got 2 centimeter distance from the F to the A. Now there's going to be a 2 centimeter distance between the third and the fifth, just like there was for our last chord, the E to the G. There was 2 centimeters in between there, okay? Now we've got 2 centimeters between the first and the third, and 2 centimeters between the sixth and the eighth, okay? And we've got 2 centimeters between the first and the third. We've got 2 centimeters between the third and the fifth. The distance between the notes in any chord never changes, okay? The distance between the first and the third in our C chord, I'm just ruining this. The distance between the first and the third in our C chord is the same as the distance between the first and the third in our F chord, okay? It's always going to be that same 2 centimeters, right? And we can see that over here, okay? So F is our first, A is our third, and C is our fifth. And that's our F chord, okay? Now, if you can see here for a moment, I'm going to put this on my guitar so that you can see what I'm talking about. okay? Now, this is our F chord, okay? You just saw me do this for the C chord. Now, F, this note right here, that's the 3rd fret of the D string, okay? The F note is our first. Now we're going to go to our 3rd, okay? Because remember, the notes that make up a chord triad are the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th, all right? Now, we've got our F note right here. That's our 1st, okay? Now we need our 3rd. Well, the 3rd of F, as we remember, was the A, okay? So if we check, do, do, re, mi, 1, 2, 3, F being the do, the 3rd of F is A. And so we can see that that fits into our F chord, right? Obviously, because the F chord is made up of the 1st, 3rd, and the 5th, okay? So we've got our F note here, we've got our 3rd note, the A, right here, and then we've got the 5th note of the chord, which is the C, right here. Okay, that's the 1st fret of the B string, okay? And so we've got the 1st, we've got the 3rd, we've got the 5th, and then this high note, the 1st fret of the high E string is an F, okay? So that's basically the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 8th, or the 1st again. Now we've got all these individual notes, the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 8th, or the F, the A, the C, and the F again, right? Now we've got all these individual notes. Now this is what makes up our chord. When we play all these at the same time, we get our F chord. You see what I mean? This is the actual guts of the guitar chords, and this is the guitar chords. These are the notes that actually make up the guitar chords that we are playing, and that is why the chords are shaped the way they are. Now, the chord is the skeleton, okay? The chord is the skeleton, the universal form, which you can move anywhere on the guitar, and it will still be recognizable as that chord, okay? The distances between the notes will always be the same. The distances between the individual notes of the chord are always the same, okay? Now, if we start on our G, okay? G is going to be our 1st, right? Do, do, re, do, mi, so, do, mi, so, mi, do, mi, so, mi, do. That's our G, okay? And you'll notice that that's what makes up the first notes. Do, mi, so, do. Right? 1st, 3rd, 5th, and then 1st again, okay? And now we're going to translate that into the A. So this is our G. Do, mi, so, mi, do, mi, so, mi, do. 1st, 3rd, 5th, 3rd, 1st, 3rd, 5th, 3rd, 1st. Okay, now we do it in the A. Do, mi, so, mi, do, mi, so, mi, do. 1st, 3rd, 5th, 3rd, 1st, 3rd, 5th, 3rd, 1st. Okay, the distance between those individual notes of those two chords are the same. They're the same chord shapes. The notes are just played slightly higher. They're played on a different part of the ruler, so to speak, you know? The distance between the individual notes are always the same. That's what I'm trying to show you guys, and that's what I've been trying to explain to us so far, okay? So just like you can play do, re, mi all over the guitar, you know, you can start do, re, mi on the G sharp. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That's your G sharp major scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Now if you do it on the C, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Now, those are they're played with totally different notes, but the fact is that the chords, the skeleton of the scale is still the same. It's always going to be recognizable. And it's the same thing with the chord. The chord is always going to be the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th scale degrees of whatever scale that you're talking about, okay? Now, if we go to our C chord, okay, do, right? The C scale is using the same notes, the same degrees of the scale as the D is, okay? Do, mi, so, mi, do. That's your C major scale. And then this is the D. Do, mi, so, mi, do. Okay? It's the same form, the same skeleton is there. They're just played on a higher, the D is just on a higher part of the ruler, okay? Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to add another note to that main triad, okay? Remember, it's the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th is what makes up a chord, okay? Now we're going to add a note in there that is not a part of that main triad, okay? We're going to do this by playing what's called a C major 7th chord. Now, I'm not going to show you the chord diagram because, well, you've seen it now. You can pause and check it out. But I want us to actually learn why it is that the notes that we play on a C major 7th are the way are what they are. Okay. Now, I'm not bragging. I always sound like I'm bragging when I say this, but an example I like to show is that if somebody asked me, play a D11th chord, okay? It's a bit of a complicated chord, but we've got our first note here, the 7th, the 9th, and the 11th, okay? And that's just what you have to do for an 11th chord, all right? Now, all the notes are right here, and you can hear it. It's a kind of a weird kind of sounding chord. It sounds good when you go from this to the D. Right? Okay, but the fact is that if somebody looked at me and said, play a D11th chord, I couldn't play it off the top of my head until I found it a little bit, but I can find it. And I want you to be able to find whatever chord you're looking for as well, okay? That's why we're going through these lessons, okay? If somebody asked, if I looked at you and I said, I want you to play an E suspended 4th, okay? And if you've never played that chord before, you should be able to look at your guitar and go, okay, well, we've got our 1st, our 3rd, our 5th in here. All I have to do is sandwich a 4th note, the 4th degree of the scale, into that chord somewhere, which is that right there. So that's how we do our E suspended 4th, okay? But I want you to be able to do that. I want to be able to look at you and ask you any chord, and you should be able to figure it out by yourself, okay? And that's what we're doing in this lesson, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the C notes of the C, the notes of the C chord individually, okay? We've got our C, we've got our 3rd E, we've got our 5th G, 1st, 3rd, 5th, 1st, or 8th, you know, the 8th and the 1st are the same thing, as we've said. 1st, 3rd, 5th, 1st, and then 3rd. We've also got that high, remember this is the high open E string, which we know E is the 3rd of C, okay? So that's C. It's basically starting the whole thing over again after this C. We've got the 1st, and then 3rd, that high E up there, right? And so those are the notes that are in our C chord, okay? We're skipping all the notes. When we play our C chord, there are notes in between that G and that C. G, C, okay? The G is the 5th, and then C is the 8th, okay? And there's the 6th and the 7th in between there, but we don't play them because the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th is the chord triad that makes up our basic chords, okay? For every chord, it's the same thing. Now, from... obviously, as I've said, this low C note, Do, notice how this Do is the same thing as this Do, okay? Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. It's because of the same note, Do, Do, okay? They're both the same note, just one is played on the 1 centimeter mark, and the other one is played on the 8 centimeter mark, okay? But the distances between these notes are always the same, no matter what, okay? That's the 1st note, and that's the 8th note of the C, just like that's the 1st note of the D, and that's the 8th note of the D. D, 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 okay? Now, they're both the same note, they're just one's played slightly higher than the other one, okay, as we've said before. Now, let's go back to our C chord, which is just the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th of our chord, right? Do, mi, so, do, mi, do, mi, so, do, mi. Okay, that's what this chord is made up of. Now, watch what we do here, okay, because this is our C major 7th, right? This is our C major 7th. The C has the little maj and then the 7th on there, okay? And what the C major 7th means is that we are going to sandwich the 7th note, the 7th scale degree, into this chord, okay? Now, if we look, the 7th is the T note in the Do, Re, Mi, right? Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Ti. Okay, so C is the 1st and T is the 7th. And then C is the 8th again. Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do, right? Now, that's what we're going to do for our major 7th chord, is we're going to find some kind of way to add that 7th note, the T note, into our major scale. Now, I'd just like to show you something really quickly, because this will help initialize our idea of the theory on this. Okay, so we've got our C is the first, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. B is our major seventh of C. Okay, and so that's what we're trying to do. We've got our first, our third, and our fifth. We've got our first, our third, and our fifth. And now we're going to add the seventh into there, okay? The seventh, the major seventh, is the B note. Now, usually in a chord, all we've got is our first and our third and our fifth, the C, the E, and the G, as I've shown you 1,000 times, okay? Now we have to find some way of adding that high B, the high major B, into this C chord, all right? So, all we have to do is find out the easiest way to add that note. Well, the thing is that for the C chord, you'll notice that obviously this note, the high C, right? That's the first fret of our B string, okay? That's the high C note. That's the eighth. Remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay? That the first note and then the eighth note. Okay? So that high C is the same thing as this one. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay? Now we have to find some way to add in that seventh note. Well, what we do when we play a C major seventh chord is we are taking that note, which is the first fret of the B string, and we're making it open, okay? Because we know this is the B string. The B string by itself, open, is the B note. And we know that B is the seventh. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7. So the B is our seventh note, right? Now you could probably guess what we're going to do to make this C major seventh work is all we have to do is we have to take this first finger off, our pointing finger, and just leave it open so that we hear that open B string, the seventh of the scale, sandwiched in between the first, the third, and the fifth, and the rest of the notes in here, okay? Now, it's a very pretty chord, eh? It's a very artistic chord. That's the C major seventh, okay? This is when the painter's paintbrush comes in. We're starting to have different textures and different emotions and feelings for our chords, okay? I love that chord. But so that is our C major seventh. What we've done is we've taken out one note in the chord and replaced it with the seventh note, which is the B in the case of the C major scale, okay? And that is how we play a C major seventh, okay? I'm just going to bring this in here so you guys can see what that looks like. That, you can go ahead and pause the video if you like to get that chord shape, okay? That is the shape of our C major seventh. So like I always say, the distances between the individual notes in a chord never changes, okay? That's the key point, all right? If I'm going to play this C major seventh chord up slightly higher, okay? So that's your D major seventh chord, okay? Now, the notes are different. It comes about in a slightly different, in a higher fashion, but the scale degrees, the distances between the notes are always going to be the same. Always the same chord skeleton. The skeleton of the chord is the same, only the skin is changed a little bit, okay? And so now, that's the point I always want to make, is that the distances between the individual notes of a chord never changes, okay? And I'm going to prove that to you right now. Alright, so now here we have our D major chord, right? We're going to try to make a D major seventh out of this chord. Now, in order to do that, first we have to figure out what all these notes are, okay? Now, remember, a chord is made of our first, the third, and the fifth degrees of the major scale, okay? So if we're in D major, we've got to have D the first, and then we've got to have the third, and we've got to have the fifth. But not necessarily in that order, okay? Now, this is another key point that we have to make, okay? D is the first note in the D major chord. chord. Now the next note up, the second fret of the G string, is an A note, okay? That's the 5th of D. If we start on our D, and we go do, re, mi, fa, so, do, re, mi, fa, so, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the next note in the chord, okay? The second fret of the G string, okay? That's an A note, and the A note is the 5th of the D, okay? So now there's a third in between that D note and that 5th note. We don't need to play it, okay? Because the thing is that it doesn't matter what order you put the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th into the chord, as long as you've got the 1st, the 3rd, and the 5th in the chord to make up the basic chord, okay? So we've got the D as the 1st, do, the A is the 5th, so, and then this next note in the D chord is another high D, okay? So we've got the 1st, the 5th, and then the 8th, or the 1st again. Do, so, do, do, do. So these two notes are the same, okay? The open D string and the 3rd fret of the B string are both D notes, okay? The root of the chord, okay? And then the next string down in our D major chord, okay, that's this one right here. That's the 2nd fret of the high E is an F sharp, and F sharp is the 3rd of D, okay? And so we're basically, in our D major chord, we've got D the 1st, A the 5th, D again, and then a high 3rd note of the D major scale, the high F sharp, okay? And so that's what makes up our D major scale, right? So now we've got our D chord. What if we want to turn it into a D major 7th, okay? Well, if we remember from our C major 7th, all we did was we took the 8th note and we brought it down one tiny fret, just one note, okay? So let's translate this into our D major chord. Now we've got our 1st, our 5th, and then this note, the 3rd fret of the B string, this note right here, is the high 8th, or the high 1st, the high D note, okay? Now, all we have to do, obviously, is we just have to take that high D note and bring it down one tiny fret, okay? So that it's on the 2nd fret now, the 2nd fret of the B string, which is a C sharp, okay? Now, that's when we get this chord right here, okay? And so, as we can see here, this finger is this whole 2nd fret on the G string, on the B string, and on the high E string. The 2nd fret is all being barred by the 1st finger. That's what this number 1 means, right? And so all we're doing is we're taking the face of our finger, turn your wrist a little bit if you have to, not too much. Don't ever turn your wrist too much, okay? You're going to bar it, and that's what makes up your D major 7, okay? Now this is also a very hugely popular chord as well, obviously. It's got that airy, dreamy, sort of tinny kind of quality to it, right? Here's a Pink Floyd song that uses it, okay? Tired of lying in the sunshine, staying home to watch the rain. You are young and life is long, and there is time to kill today. Okay, so they're in that part of that song, to make that dreamy, dreamscape sort of quality for that part of the song, they're using the D major 7th and the A major 7th, okay? And so that's what they're using there, okay? So the D major 7th, all the major 7th chords have that same sort of airy, dreamy kind of quality to it, right? Now, the notes in these two chords, the C major 7th and the D major 7th, the fingerings are totally different, okay? You know, but just because the fingerings are different doesn't mean the scale degrees aren't the same, okay? Now, the notes are different too. You're using slightly different notes, but the bones are the same. The bones of the chord structure are all the same, okay? And that's the key point we're trying to make. The distance between the individual notes of the C major 7th is the same as the distance between the individual notes of the D major 7th chord, right? Okay? And so that is what makes up our D major 7th chord. and this is how people will combine different notes, different scale degrees within these chords to make special kind of chords. This is how we make up chords, and this is a very important lesson to learn for any aspiring guitarist. Okay, so that's the actual guts of the chords for us, okay? You know, it would take me forever to show you all the specific inversions of all the different chords, but at least now we have an idea of what a chord is and why the individual notes of a chord are being played and why they're being played the way they are, okay? Nothing is arbitrary in music, okay? Nothing is random. Everything is connected. Everything is there for a reason. Every note in a chord is played in the way it is for a reason, okay? Now, there are two major points that I want you to walk away from these lessons with, this past lesson, okay? Point number one is that every chord is made up of a first, a third, and a fifth, okay? No matter what the chord is, right? So if we've got our C chord, the C is going to be made up of the first, the third, and the fifth of the C major scale, just as the D is going to be made up of the first, the third, and the fifth of its own respective major scale. The major scale being the Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. That's your major scale, right? Now, the basic major chord is always made up of this triad, the first, the third, and the fifth. That chord skeleton is always recognizable, just as a chair is recognizable no matter what material it's made out of, right? So, lesson number two, okay, and this is the most important lesson, is that the distances between the notes, the distance between the individual notes of every chord is always the same, no matter what chord you're playing it in, okay? The first, the third, and the fifth, the first, the third, and the fifth are a set distance between one another, okay? And that distance never changes, right? Do, Mi, So are the first, the third, and the fifth of the major scale, the Do, Re, Mi scale, okay? And no matter where you play them, that distance is never going to change, okay? Do, Mi, So, there's your G, okay? Do, Mi, So, here's your A, Do, Mi, So, and then here's your C. Do, Mi, So, okay? Now, the notes are different, but that same skeleton, the chord skeleton of the first, the third, and the fifth, the distance between those notes never changes no matter which chord it is, okay? And that's, you must be sick of me saying that, I'll bet, but that's a very important thing for you to burn into your brain in order for you to be able to play and start to understand these chords, okay? And to play with them and to make up your own chords, right? So hopefully we all got some kind of basic theory for chord structure and the guts of the chords from this video, okay? Now, in our next video, we're going to start getting into what are called key signatures, okay? Now, this is going to provide the larger framework pattern for our chords to float around, okay? Now, the chord is like an inch, and the key signatures are like expanding into measurements of feet. Okay? We're getting into larger musical distances that we're going to play with, right? And you'll know what I mean when we get there, okay? So for now, safe trips and happy trails. I'm Dustin Cormier, and I'll see you in the next video in the series.